Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Um, it really and truly is an honor and a privilege to have worked with a group of authors now on, I think, 4 books and a second edition of one of them. This book that was just released yesterday at the Africa Energy Forum is about financing transmission, and in particular, it's about how to involve the private sector in the development of new transmission projects. And when we started writing this, how long ago? 6 months? Months ago. We kind of had some misgivings is not the right word, but we definitely thought about whether the topic would be interesting and whether it is topical. And many of us have just come back from the Africa Energy Forum. This is the first Africa Energy Forum I have been to where generation was not effectively the only topic that was discussed. The first 2 sessions that I went to were all about transmission. One of them was about how to interconnect markets. One of them was about how to involve the private sector in transmission. And the last session that I went to was a session about whether the IPP model is sustainable, whether independent power projects still are a sustainable method of involving the private sector in generation. So my takeaway from the Africa Energy Forum is that there are a number of focus areas now. Transmission is definitely and certainly one of them. And generation is still a topic of interest, but not quite as much as it was. So with that, let me hand it over to Mohammed for a moment.
Yeah, no, I first of all want to thank you, Ryan, for your time. As Ryan mentioned, he's worked with us now on essentially all of these books, 4 or 5 of them, and they all take a lot of time and a lot of commitment, and we really appreciate that. And thank you for hosting us here today as well for this discussion. You're right, this was one of the first AEFs that I've been to as well, where the focus wasn't on generation alone. And we brought in from the US with us about 400 copies of this book, and they were all gone almost immediately. And they've asked us for more copies by yesterday. And we actually had to print little cards with QR codes for everyone to access them digitally. As Ryan mentioned, we started this conversation about 6-7 months ago for this handbook, and Ryan has dedicated quite a bit of time for this book. It was actually 2 weeks. It took us 2 weeks altogether to write this book. It was all virtual, which made it even more painful, as you could imagine. But I think the resource was incredibly well timed, and I think there's a genuine need for it, and to really contribute to the discussion on how to promote energy accessibility and carbon reduction. I think it was very well timed. Yeah, thank you, Ryan.
Great. Perfect. So maybe we should just introduce the authors. I'm Ryan Ketchum. Mohammed Lorawi is to my right. Stratos Tuvelarius, I believe. Apologies, Stratos, if I have not pronounced your name properly, is with us.
Ryan.
Thank you. Stratos is with us. We hope that Kaushik Ray and Jay Govender will be able to join us. They both. There's Kaushik right there.
Hi, I'm here.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, Kaushik. Right. So with that, I think the format that we'd like to follow is sort of a question and answer roundtable kind of a discussion. I know that Mohammed and Elizabeth have been kind enough to prepare a few questions to get us started. but we really would like for this to be as interactive as it can be. So please feel free to ask questions either in the chat box or just unmute yourself and ask. And I should note that we are recording this. So with that, Mohammed.
Yeah, maybe I'll summarize a couple of the questions that we received ahead of time. When we've asked people to register for this event, we also asked if there were any questions. So we received some questions from people that registered leading up to this. So one of the questions was, why now? I feel like you've already touched on this, but we have seen such a focus on generation, renewables, and decentralization. What's spurred the decision to write a book on the financing of power transmission assets?
Okay. Kaushik, do you want to take that one?
Why now? Well, I think there's a few answers to that. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kaushik Ray. I'm a partner at Trinity. Also very happy and very honored to have been asked to assist in a number of the Understanding Power book series, along with Ryan and Mohammed. Why now is a really good question. I think what's happened in a number of jurisdictions is there's been such a focus on generation, particularly independent power projects, so grid connected, large scale, utility scale projects. And there's been really probably for the last decade, a real focus on that, quite rightly, in a sense. And what's happened in a number of countries, a number of jurisdictions, whether that's Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, a number of jurisdictions on the continent, have found that actually the demand has not quite kept up with the predicted rates, and actually there's a potential oversupply. Part of the issue with that oversupply of electricity is also simply that not the entire country is grid connected. So you then have an issue. Number one, you have an issue that because of the oversupply, the way that IPPs are typically structured, they have payments, capacity payments built into the power purchase agreements that govern them, which effectively means that for the most they are take or pay structures, meaning that the off-taker must pay for any electricity that's produced, but also pays a charge for the fact that the power is available and is there to be used. So potentially in some countries where there is oversupply, the off-taker is effectively paying for power that it can't then sell on and distribute. So there's definitely a gap to be plugged there, and building out grid infrastructure, both on the transmission and then on the distribution side, is a key part of that. So I think that's the main reason why now. Stratos, I'll let you jump in.
Thanks, Kaushik. And again, it's a privilege to be with such an esteemed group of colleagues to write this book. It was a great experience. Just a couple of things to add to what Kaushik said. I think we need to remember that transmission and distribution is the enabling infrastructure for renewables and green options. There will be limitations to how much renewables we can add if we leave the transmission system and the distribution system the way that it is today in Africa. Electric vehicles will increase the demand for electricity and will change where the electricity is used versus where it's consumed. So you need to move a larger amount of electricity around. Last but not least, there will be decarbonization is picking up, and the implication of this is that certain countries that rely on fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, will have to reduce their reliance on these fuels, and short and medium term, trade of electricity will have to step in. So across countries in the region, there will be more trade, more use of transmission. So I think the time is now also in terms of awareness of the issues and availability of finance to be able to support such projects that have been needed for a long time, especially in Africa. Over.
Let me just add, thank you very much, Kaushik and Stratus. Let me just add some numbers to kind of put those comments into perspective, particularly around the need for transmission to integrate renewables. And I think there are really two great examples of this. Egypt in the early 2000s found itself short on generation capacity, and they embarked on a very large program to construct new generation. Much of it was renewable. And in order to do that, they needed to strengthen their transmission network. And they constructed over 3,600 kilometers of 500 kV transmission lines over a period of 6 years in order to bring renewable resources from the south of the country to the load center. In a similar manner, South Africa has commissioned a number of studies about where are their renewable resources, where are the best wind resources, the best solar resources. And they have consistently found that they need to build a lot of transmission to move power from the southwest of the country, again, to the load centers around Joburg. So that's just sort of two examples of the level of investment that is sometimes required to integrate large-scale renewables.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to open up some questions, but we do have some other questions that we've received. One question that I would like to get to before we kind of, I guess, move on is, in the African market, what have you observed to be the largest obstacle to transmission financing? And how do you envision this book addressing that?
My thought is that the largest impediment is that there's not really a business model that has been well developed and socialized. I think that there are techniques that can be used to facilitate private investment in transmission, but if I asked anyone in this room, how do you facilitate private investment in generation, everyone knows the answer. And it's gotten down to 3 letters, which is IPP. No one sort of seems to have the same kind of socialized understanding of how that works in transmission. So I think that's one of the big kind of stumbling blocks. Don't know if Kaushik or Stratus, you want to add to that?
Maybe I'll chip in. I think we need to mention that there is a lack of financial resources to do everything that is needed. We're not saying that, for example, public sector money is not good for transmission. It's just there's not enough money mobilized to do the things that are needed. So the private sector needs to come in addition to the public sector.
Thank you, Stratos. Maybe we can open it up to any questions. I don't want to take up.
Sure. So I wanted to follow up with what Ryan is just saying. My name is Ronald, DLA Piper office in Zimbabwe, but I'm based here in London for maybe a couple of years. So I just wanted to ask, would it also be that the transmission sector has always been dominated by the utilities themselves? So for instance, in Zimbabwe, there's only one utility which does the distribution and the transmission. And it's sort of like a monopoly. So I don't know, could that be a factor with other African countries on why there's not been much investment in transmission as opposed to generation, where they've sort of like opened up the space and everyone is sort of like at their playing?
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. I think that for a long time, the standard wisdom was that utilities were a monopoly and they needed to be regulated as such. And then a way to separate out generation was found. But I think that the fact that economics textbooks use utilities as a classic example, and in particular transmission and distribution as a classic example of a sector that is, a monopoly and always will be, has sort of discouraged perhaps people from thinking about other ways of doing things. So yes, I think that's right.
Go ahead, Professor Staros.
Sorry to monopolize this, but I think it's worth mentioning one thing that I think is a misconception in the industry, and that is that ownership and control, operating control of an asset go together, which is not really the case. They can be decoupled. Most utilities are afraid that if the ownership of an asset is with somebody else, they're losing control. It has been proven around the world, especially in Latin America, that these two can be decoupled nicely, and the private sector can come in, provided that the framework is set up right, to have an efficient design and financing of a project, and the utility maintains operating control of that asset.
I actually had a follow-up question for you, Ryan.
Go ahead.
You mentioned that there's no one agreed upon model for transmission financing, and I think in the book you touch upon 4 different models. I won't list them out, but I was wondering if you had a preferred of those 4, or where you see things going based on those 4.
Sure, thank you. So the 4 models are a whole of network concession. So you take the entire transmission network and concession it to the private sector. The Philippines did this in the early to mid 2000s very successfully. They have attracted $4 to $5 billion in capex since then. The second one would be an independent power transmission project, an IPT, or maybe an independent transmission project, an ITP, which are really different acronym for the same thing. The third one would be privatizations, and the fourth one would be a merchant line. And I feel like maybe we should just kind of explain these 4 different models in a bit more detail before we move on. So I'll take whole of network concessions, and then I'll hand it over to someone else for ITPs. So in a whole of network concession, typically the entire transmission network is leased to a project company which is established to hold the leasehold interest in the network and to operate it and to add assets as they are necessary. Those assets are generally added in the name of and they are owned by the utility that granted the concession. But they go into a regulatory rate base that is the concessionaires. And 2 of the sort of big challenges, I think there are really 3 big challenges with concessions. The first is the perception that Stratus has already discussed about control and about control of an asset that is very important to really every nation. The second is the independent regulation. You really need a regulator that has a strong track record of balancing the interests of consumers and investors appropriately in order for concession to work. And then finally, transmission assets require continuing and ongoing investment. Unlike a power project where all the CapEx goes in before the commercial operations date, with a transmission system, you need continuing investment effectively forever. And those investments are depreciated over very long periods of time. Many of the assets have an economic life of 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. And they are depreciated over that long period of time to keep rates low and manageable. But this leads to the need to pay a buyout payment at the termination or expiration of a concession, and that buyout payment can be quite sizable. So I think although that structure has been deployed in a number of countries very effectively, it does have a number of challenges that need to be overcome. So with that, Kaushik or Stratos, I don't know if one of you would like to take independent transmission projects.
Happy to do so, Stratos, unless you'd like to.
No, please proceed.
I'll
Yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
So independent transmission projects, or sometimes called independent power transmission model, IPT or ITP, depending on your preference for acronyms. The easiest way to think about them is to think about them in the context of a relatively standard or typical PPP project or independent power project. I'm just wondering whether if I can share a screen just so you have something to look at as I talk. Is that sharing something useful or not?
Not yet, but it looks like it's going to.
Okay. Well, anyway, I just what I'm trying to share is just the contractual structure. But really, the thing to think about here is that IPTs are effectively projects that are issued under a long-term contract, usually between the state-owned utility and a special purpose vehicle project company. That contract is typically for a prolonged period of time, 25 to 30 years, and it will define really the economics of the project, i.e., how much is the transmission company paying this SPV over the course of time for the delivery of and typically the operation of the transmission infrastructure. So those contracts, they're often called transmission services agreements, TSAs. They sometimes can be leases, sometimes can be simple concession agreements. So it's really the public sector going out to the private sector and saying, here is what I need from a public service perspective is a transmission line that goes from point A to point B. I, government, or I, the transmission company, together with government, will ensure that you, the private sector developer, have land rights, have way leave rights, and all the relevant consents and permits that you need from a government perspective. But otherwise, we're giving you the rights by way of a concession or lease or whatever the right that's given to do a number of things. So it could be build, own, operate. It could be build, own, operate, transfer. There are a number of types of model that fall under that IPT structure. But in a sense, the easiest way to think about it is any sort of private sector infrastructure, typical private sector infrastructure project. So, for example, a toll road or a bridge or an independent power project. There are a few issues that relate to that. Land is a big one, and I suspect we will talk about it a little bit further in more detail as we discuss today, because particularly in a large country, and in a number of countries, so Ethiopia is an exception to that rule, but for many countries, there are different types of land rights. So there could be, for example, tribal or nomadic rights. There could be private sector land, public land, trust land. All of these different types of rights, and so your transmission line will go over different parcels of property that have different rights attached to them. There will need to be obviously structures built on pieces of land, but also access required. So there will be easements or wayleaves as they're called, and securing and procuring those and giving them over to the private sector for concession period is just one of the challenges. But without going into too much detail now, just as by way of an introduction, that's in broad strokes what an IPT model looks like.
Thank you, Kaushik. Stratus, would you like to cover privatizations?
You're probably in a better position to do that, but why don't you go first and then I can chip in?
Sure. So privatization is effectively a sale of not just the assets, but usually also the company that owns those assets. So usually it is a sale of shares of the transmission company. The UK did this in, I think, 1990, and a whole lot of interesting structures, including the so-called golden share, came out of the UK's successful privatization of their transmission systems. Like the concession structure, this structure has some significant drawbacks. It has some significant advantages as well, but it does have some drawbacks. And the drawbacks that immediately come to mind are you have the same concern about selling a national asset to the private sector. That's a big drawback. And you also have the same concern about regulation. Rates need to be set by an independent regulator, and in many emerging market countries generally, either there is not yet an independent regulator or one has been established, but it has not yet built a track record of balancing the interests of investors and consumers. So I think those are kind of the two biggest problems. The big advantage is for a country that wants to completely take any obligation to invest in transmission off of the national balance sheet, this is the way to do it. It will forevermore, unless it is purchased or nationalized by the government, that problem is in the hands of the private sector. So that is the key advantage. Stratus, don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, let me just make a couple of more general statements, not specific to the business model that can be used. I think we all need to recognize that the main issue, the most important issue, especially in Africa, is the fact that the cost of power supply is higher than what the tariffs indicate. So you have a gap between revenue and cost, which is increasing. So why we're talking about the private sector? Most of the people think that the private sector brings in financing, period. If you are in the business and you understand what the private sector brings, the most valuable thing is efficiency. So we need to make sure that whatever model we use, whatever structure we set up, that we bring in that efficiency to solve Africa's problem, which is the gap between cost and revenue. So the transmission system, in some respects, it's a little bit easier than distribution, for example, because the required tariff is lower than generation, definitely, and maybe distribution also. The tricky part in transmission is the way leaves, as Kosik pointed out, and making sure that we choose the appropriate model for the specific country, for the circumstances. If that is done, these projects could be implemented easily, quickly, and efficiently. Distribution is the difficult nut to crack, but I guess here we're focusing mostly on transmission. Over.
Kaushik, would you like to talk about merchant lines?
I can do, yes. Not necessarily my specialist topic, but I mean, basically, a merchant line is either one or more lines that connect to existing lines that. So, for example, if there's a mine, for example, that is otherwise isolated and not connected to the grid, it's perfectly possible. Actually, a good example, a real life example, is the expansion of the transmission line in Mozambique to the Mosal aluminium smelter. So obviously aluminium plants require a huge amount of electricity, and the aluminium plant in Mozambique, just post-conflict, was in a relatively unconnected and isolated area. A transmission line was built out to connect to the project. As it was, that also became integrated into the wider grid. So perhaps it isn't actually the best example. But if you used an example of a mine or an industrial unit, then really the merchant line is connects that particular unit or project to via a transmission network. The important thing about the merchant lines are that the tariff setting, everything that's to do with the economics of that line, is really at the hands of the developer themselves. So there's very little kind of government interface relating to that. Ryan, you probably want to add a little bit to that.
I mean, I think it was interesting that you pointed out in the example that you gave that the transmission line was eventually absorbed into the national network.
Right.
And this is actually a pretty big problem with merchant transmission lines. There was a merchant transmission line that connected the eastern part of Australia to the western part of Australia. It was built by a private consortium of developers who wanted to arbitrage the price of electricity in the east and the price of electricity in the west. And that worked well for several years until the owner of the grid decided to build its own transmission line. And it effectively greatly diminished the opportunity for that consortium of developers to earn their profits. A couple of other examples. There is a merchant line that connects Tasmania to the rest of Australia. Tasmania, of course, has a huge amount of hydroelectric resources that can generate at very low rates. So that was very effective, I think. There's also one that connects Manhattan to Long Island, believe it or not. And that's because in New York, the New York Independent System Operator runs a system of marginal pricing. So the price of electricity on Long Island, given transmission constraints and other things, may be very different from the price in other parts of New York. And again, they sort of arbitrage those two prices. So there are really some compelling disadvantages with merchant lines. It seems like at least I tend to be focusing on disadvantages. They do tend to have a risk of being subsumed into the network. And as Kaushik said, a government needs to make a free and fully informed choice not to regulate how much it costs to use that line. And I think that that's a fairly rare emerging market government that's going to make that type of a decision. So thank you very much for that question, which turned out to be very chunky.
Thank you for all those answers.
I actually wanted to check if Mohammed, Jay, or Samson were able to join the call, and if you wanted to add anything.
This is Mohammed. I think I see Samson on as well. I'll just say, first of all, I mean, a pleasure to be here. Really excited to see this resource finally, making it out into the community, and just to offer almost like a macro perspective on the observations that both Kaushik and Ryan just shared. One of the things we realized in writing this book is that the development of Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa's transmission, sector is going to be non-traditional, which is to say that it is highly likely that where there are, cases that merchant lines make sense, they may be built for, specialized purposes for, feeding large industrial facilities, for connecting sort of disparate regions. I think of sort of the north-south connection in Mozambique. And so sometimes things will be done a certain way, sometimes they'll be done the traditional utility-driven way. I think as we approach the book, and it's worth just restating, we sort of assume that there is no standard pathway for the market, that it's going to be an aggregation of whatever makes sense at the time, wherever the money happens to be available, wherever the opportunities are. And that's worth noting because that's a more difficult market. If anything, it's going to be an amazing laboratory, and I think in sub-Saharan Africa for how many different ways transmission can grow. But we can't stick to the traditional large institutional, large grid first approach because it's going to take too much time and there's just not enough money. So it's an all of the above, and that's complicated, and that's sort of why we have to be even more sensitive to developing the capacity of those on the ground to handle what's going to be a significantly more complex transmission sector. So I'm just happy to see this resource because that challenge is so great.
Thank you, Mohammed. And Samson, would you like a minute to briefly introduce yourself and add any comments you might have? But at the very least, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm Samson from Power Africa. I'm based in Pretoria. And I think my just few comments is just understanding policy framework within Africa, sensitivity of each of these models to changes in policies and regulations is very important, especially when government changes hands and previous contracts are reviewed or suspended. The resilience of each of the model against such changes is very.
Samson, we've lost you.
Yeah, I apologize. Samson is in South Africa, and I know they've been having a lot of rollouts and brownouts, so I apologize. Maybe we can give him a minute to join back.
Why don't we take another question and hopefully he'll join back.
All right. Any questions from?
Hello, can I say something?
Go ahead, Femi.
Okay, yeah, this is Femi from Brickstone Africa, based out of Lagos. We're an infrastructure advisory firm. And my view and our view is we see the private transmission infrastructure implementation working from your traditional BOT PPP type arrangement. Now you have these transmission companies owned by the states. They have an expansion need. I feel we don't need to invent the wheel. They just need to come up with a price model that a private developer can go build, operate, and manage the transmission lines and transfer back to the utility company, the transmission utility company of the government at a specific period of time. That way, the developer is not too bothered about the whole pricing arrangement that is going on within the generation and distribution and transmission. He's just focused on getting the transmission infrastructure based on a build, operate, and transfer arrangement in respect of the need of the municipality of the government and having a fixed charge. Now, to assure him of his revenue, he can have some first charge from the collections made on the generation companies as a first line of charge. There's various mechanisms to further guarantee the transmission company on a BOT basis is revenue assurances beyond what the sovereign states might provide. So my own view is we need to think around a traditional PPP BOT arrangement to deliver infrastructure at these early stages. As things go much sophisticated, then we can start moving into the transmission company being an integral part of the electric value chain. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I mean, it sounds like you are very much in favor of the IPT model, is kind of what I took away from that.
Yes, I agree because the various states, parastatals are already used to, you come in and build the transmission infrastructure on the specification basis, and we just negotiate a pricing that works. Now, the beauty of this model is within the maybe like a 20-year operation or 30-year operation or 30-year operation, within the operation period, a number of things can happen. There could be options for it to be bought over much earlier by a more large, utility company out of Africa in itself. It could be so. The most important thing is there's already a demand to uptake more power into areas where there's power is needed. So you want to not bother the developer on too much of intricacies within the electricity value chain and allow him to focus on delivering it at a fixed price. And he can also have a first charge on the various inflows that come into the transmission company's cash flow. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that focus is actually very, very valuable. I really do. Between the focus that companies who are really interested in building and maintaining transmission lines bring, and the availability to compete and to offer a competitive tender regularly, really has a tendency to drive down prices. And so just a couple of things that I found interesting on this pricing point. Here in the UK, the IPT model has been used to connect offshore wind farms to the shore. And Ofgem, the regulator, estimated how much that would cost. And then they determined to use an IPT model to do that. They were pretty surprised by the pricing that they got, which was somewhere between 23 and 34%, depending on the project, lower than what they were expecting. And so they saved approximately £3 billion of investment. The same thing has happened in Brazil, and in the US, a study estimated that were the US to adopt more IPTs and to really adopt that model, that there would be cost savings between 20 and 30%. So I think that focus is very valuable.
Thank you, Ryan. That's very helpful. And that actually answers one of the most common questions we've received so far, which is how does private participation affect the price? But it looks like Professor Stratos has a reaction. Please go ahead.
A couple of things. I think what Ryan mentioned is extremely important, to make sure that whatever you've done, there is a price discovery through competitive bidding. because guessing what the right price is, it's something very difficult. And that has been proven, as Ryan pointed out, in many different places. The other thing that I wanted to mention, which goes back to an earlier comment that I made, is this fine difference between BOT and BOOT. I think, at least this is my judgment, is that most IPT models would be the BOT approach, as the speaker pointed out. The BOOT, if you sit down and you clarify it enough, you need to look at who operates and who maintains the transmission line. In most cases, the power company operates the transmission line. In other words, it decides how the flow is developing. What the developer does, the investor, it maintains the line. So we need to decouple from the O&M, the O and the M. And it's mostly the M, the maintenance, that stays with the developer. So in most cases, even if we call it BOOT, in reality, it is BOT.
Great point.
Thank you so much for that additional point, Professor Stratos. And I saw Samson was back online, and it looked like you had that. Yeah, please go ahead, Samson.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to also just put a response a bit to Femi's point. Interestingly, Nigeria Transmission Company, maybe I'm not sure if it was when it was Transmission Company, they tried implementing the IPT model, and the challenge was they even went out as far as putting out bids for interested investors and EPC companies to get projects, but they stopped the whole process at a point, and the reason, according to them, was that there was lack of knowledge on how the model works and how the structure of the model, and also that the market as at that time wasn't strong enough. They believe that it wasn't ripe for them at that point. So I believe strongly, like the knowledge put together in this book is also a form of informing those decision makers, policy makers, and the regulators about the structuring of this IPT model, and possibly or probably they might revisit some of those previous tenders or engagement they've had in the past. So that's just my response to Femi. Thanks.
Thank you, Samson. Maybe I can open it up again to any questions, either here in person or virtually.
Hi, this is Geraldine from USADF. I had just sent a text question here. I'll just repeat it again. On page, first of all, great book. Thank you so much for sharing, and looking forward to diving deeper into it. But I just had a quick question, and maybe if there's time permitted, you can elaborate a little bit on page 12 of the book about private partners, not funders, given that I've mostly worked on the funding side and hoping to try to get private sector engagements in some of these projects. I'm curious, what is the how to do that versus the we need to do that? Outside of South Africa being an example of it. I'm just curious if you can respond to that. That would be great. Thank you.
Hi, Geraldine. It's great to see you here. I think before I respond to that, and by the way, I'm not sure I have a very good answer to that question, but before I respond to it, let me say that we're having some technical difficulties seeing the questions that you've submitted, that everyone has submitted in writing. So please raise your hand and ask if you'd like. So Geraldine, I think that this is, I think really this is one where governments need to lead. Governments need to to kind of do a bit of structuring, think about how they want to involve the private sector in transmission, and put together tenders for these types of projects. In the absence of that, it is of course possible for groups like GridWorks to put together unsolicited proposals. And Richard Ali is with us. He's the legal counsel at GridWorks. I don't know if you want to talk for just a minute about how that process can sometimes work, or.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's just, so I think the point made on engagement with government and key stakeholders is, vital to all of these types of things. The more work, I suppose, a government can do with feasibility work and preparation work is helpful. But yeah, there are other options where approaches can sort of be made outside of that regime. So I think there's a number of ways that these things can be done. But the key takeaway probably from our side is that that receptivity in government to be open to these sort of things.
Okay. Thanks, Richard.
Koshak, please go ahead.
Thanks. It's a great question, Geraldine. And as Ryan says, it's really a lot of the answer comes down to governments. I think it's worth just at this point for everyone's benefit, just sort of framing what we're talking about here. And the framing is really that age-old discussion that goes to government budgetary allocations. So any government in our home countries has a limited budget, and that budget with many competing needs, from healthcare to other social infrastructure. Very often there's simply not enough. These transmission line projects, particularly the large scale ones, are very capital intensive, and that is a big amount of money to go out in a year or over a 2-3 year period of time. And so the typical advantage of bringing the private sector in is not only have you passed the risk of delivery, i.e. of the building and the construction of that piece of infrastructure, but also of the financing of it. So in a typical IPT type of model, there's not a single penny that really government has to put its hand in its pocket for the purposes of the capital expenditure. The payment, if you will, is for the availability and the use of the infrastructure over a prolonged period of time. So it has much less of an impact on a budget. It can be part of a kind of a regular payment rather than a large capital expenditure. And I think, look, all of that is all very obvious, and I think we're all aware of that. But it's really important, I think, to frame it in that context that transmission infrastructure, like anything, is just costs an awful lot of money. The difference, I think, one of the key differences is it's not always possible to recoup large-scale transmission infrastructure in the way that it's possible for example, electricity generation. And the reason being that, and it's maybe a little bit more on the distribution side, but ultimately what pays for the infrastructure is providing electricity to more customers, more consumers, whether individuals or businesses, that pay for the electricity, and part of the payment for the electricity is effectively a wheeling charge. But that doesn't really work if you've got very few consumers or customers at the end. So the economics of it don't always work well enough for there to be even private sector finance to come in. And private sector finance is typically for a project 12 to 15 years. So very often you might need this additional sort of concessional public funding, so money coming in from the from development agencies and bilateral agencies that's earmarked for public projects, which have longer tenors. to allow for the repayment of that to come into place. So I think hopefully, Geraldine, that answers a little bit your question, but I think it's always worth framing in that context of what's the need really here.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for the response. I definitely needed that clarification when I read that part, but this was very helpful. Thank you.
No problem. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Koshak, for that clarification. I do see that there's one hand that's up. Tom, would you like to come off mute and ask your question or make your comment?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate you guys working on this resource and holding this event. It's been really interesting, and I think the resource was very useful, and I'm looking forward to engaging with it more. My question, I guess I have two questions. The first is whether you think that the West Africa power pool lines, that cross-border lines like the CLSG line, for example, where they've essentially commissioned an O&M contractor that will manage the lines and also collect payments from the utilities in each of the countries that has access to the line. Does that provide any early sort of proof of concept around the IPTL concept that you think could be used to build on in other contexts? I know they've struggled a bit in some cases with getting things like escrow accounts and so on organized, but again, there might be opportunities to learn from that. And then the second question, well, maybe I'll just leave it at that because there's so little time left. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think that particularly at this very early and nascent stage, any project is almost a great project. And I think that the CLSG is a great example of what can be done. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it interconnects Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Gabon? Ghana? No? Okay, there's a fourth country in it.
Guinea.
Guinea, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting project. It is up and running, and it is moving power from east to west. I think it has a very interesting structure, if you will, from a tariff perspective. What we argued for in the book is that it is very important to pay project companies for the availability of transmission, regardless of the number of megawatt hours that are actually transmitted. And that's not how the CLSG tariff structure works. Instead, the buyer and seller of power pay per megawatt hour that is moved, and they need to secure they need to provide security for their payments. And the kind of adverse effect of that is that if they move more power, then the amount of liquidity, escrows, letters of credit, and demand guarantees they have to post increases. So it creates a perverse incentive that incentivizes them not to use the line if they're not able to go through that process. Curiously, you would think that if you were going to go with megawatt hours, you would just go with megawatt hours. That's also not how it's done. If not enough megawatt hours are moved, are transmitted, then there is an obligation on all the utilities to pay an additional amount at the end of the year. Which, I mean, I see the advantage of that structure. In a way, nobody likes to pay for assets that are not being used. So maybe they have delayed that pain by maybe up to a year. But I think that it has created some perverse incentives. But of course, at least my view is it's still a great project. Don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the question, and Ryan for your answer on that. So we're at the hour, and I want to be aware of everyone's time. Thank you all for taking the time to join this discussion today, and thank you to Koshak, Samson, Mohammed, and Professor Stratos for joining us. Ryan, a big thank you, and Hunton, Andrews, Kurth for hosting this discussion. Really appreciate you all for taking the time. But if you have any final remarks, any of the authors, please keep it to a few seconds, but thank you.
I have a final remark, which is we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to CLDP and ALSF for facilitating and funding all of these books. You guys have done an absolutely amazing job of herding a bunch of cats that are very difficult to manage. So thank you for that. And also, could you maybe talk about where everyone who's not with us could download the PDF version?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much, Ryan. And with that, I actually would like to thank the Power Africa Initiative, which has made all of this possible. For those of you who are not familiar, Power Africa is a whole government initiative that was launched in 2013 and has been working on the continent since. And our office has been funded by them since 2014, and that's what allowed us to do this project. So a big thank you to them. The book can be accessed on our website at CLDP, that's cldp.doc.gov/understanding. And you can access all of the books. They're all available except the new one in English, French, and Amharic. This new one will be available in French in the next couple of weeks, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And we will also, with this book, like we've done with the last book, we'll have a little bit more of content as well. We'll provide some slide decks for each chapter, and we'll also do video explainers for each chapter by one of the different authors. So that's coming soon, and we hope to have that online in the next few weeks as well. Yeah, so thank you all. Koshak, did you have something to say? I'm sorry, I think I saw your camera on.
No, that's fine. Just to say, I put the link in the chat for those who want it. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone.